Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilman is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 11 of my Mean Streets of Gadgetzan card review. This time around, I'm going back to catch up on some cards I missed along the way, so these might not be the freshest reveals, but I certainly wanted to give them their due time and see if these are going to be some good cards, and in fact, I do think there are some pretty strong ones in this little set of reveals. So let's go ahead and jump right in, starting off with a new Mage Minion. This is the Cabal Crystal Runner, a 6 mana 5/5, and this is really almost the new Thing from Below, right? There's a lot of similarities between this card and Shaman's Thing from Below. This has a similar cost reduction, but this time it's reduced by 2 for every secret you've played this game, as opposed to every totem that you've summoned. So it doesn't have Taunt, which is one considerable downside, because one of the things that makes Thing from Below so frustrating is that really cheap taunt that can sometimes protect the other more valuable minions on the board, like Thunderbluff Valiant, for instance. So this isn't quite as powerful as a minion, but it's still awfully good, I think, and will very easily be played for 0 mana if Secret Mage becomes a thing, which seemingly I think it will. Just even in a deck like a Reno Mage, this is playable because there's going to be a few secrets worth playing. There are some new cards that reduce the cost of secrets or synergize with secrets in other ways. So mages and secrets finally feel like they're going to be very, very relevant, and this card certainly doesn't hurt and capitalizes on that synergy. So there are going to be opportunities where you can play this as early as like turn 3. If you have a couple cards like Cabal Lackey in the early game that allow you to play really cheap secrets, there's a good chance you can get this out really even before the mid game. So it's going to be both that late game free body, but also sometimes that early free or even 2 mana body that's very hard to deal with for opponents that early in the game. So everything about this seems fantastic. It's probably not, again, as good as Thing from Below, but Thing from Below is a historically amazing card. So that's not that's not to say this card won't be played. It certainly will. It's fantastic and almost as good as one of the game's best cards. So we'll have to see how this works in Mage and the kinds of decks it works in, but in that environment, it's going to be an incredible card. So let's move on to the next one. This is the new Priest to Minion Mana Geode. This is something that people have been waiting for a very, very, very long time, which is another good 2 mana Priest Minion. They've kind of had a gap there for a number of expansions, meaning that Priest Hero Power on turn 2 is a very common play, and typically you don't get any value out of that Hero Power, so you basically pass on turn 2 if you play Priest a lot, and you'll do it rather often. So people are thinking that this card will fill in that gap, and I've seen a lot of people very excited about this card, some very positive early reactions to Mana Geode, because they say it's finally the 2 mana minion we need, and it's a fantastic one with a very powerful effect. The Mana Geode, of course, is a 2/3, and whenever it's healed, it summons a 2/2 crystal. So in many ways, this turns your hero power as Priest into a summon a 2/2, which, you know, Priest hero power is arguably one of the weaker ones in the game just because it has a much less direct impact on the board. But this makes it much, much better when you're able to activate your Mana Geode. I think the biggest problem here is that it's going to be very, very difficult to activate your Mana Geode. A lot of people are excited about the seemingly infinite value that this card provides, but I'm a little more worried about the inconsistency issues and the fact that often you'll just play this on turn 2 and it will be dead before you actually get to do anything with it. So in other words, the Fiery War Axe will come out and kill it, or the Tunnel Trog will just trade into it, or the Totem Golem will just trade into it, and you'll be left with just a dead minion, right? Like, you won't actually often get to summon the 2/2 crystal. Even if this does live through turn 2 and you are able to trade into something to damage this minion, which will be possible. You see that pretty often with Northshire Cleric. If you play it early, it's able to trade and take some damage, and then you can heal it up for the heal effect. The problem, of course, is that Northshire Cleric on 1 naturally leads into your hero power on turn 2. This on turn 2 doesn't quite as naturally lead into your hero power on turn 3, just because you'll end up floating a mana, or there may be another minion you'd rather play on turn 3. For instance, there's the new 3-mana minion that will buff this minion's health, and this minion clearly gets better with health buffs because it's more likely to survive and gives you more ways to heal it. If you're able to get this out with a Power Word Shield or any other sort of health buff, and it survives for a couple turns, that's good because it can help negate gaps in your curve. Like sometimes on turn 4, you just don't have much to do as Priest, and you end up healing a minion, and that feels like a pretty weak turn. With a mana Geode that has been buffed, that's going to feel like a much better turn because you're going to both get to restore some health here, but also summon a 2/2. I think it's just going to be somewhat hard to pull that off. This won't always live as long as you want it to. The good thing there is that it will probably force a reaction from your opponent, and that can alter their play or make them be a little less efficient if they have to use, a lightning bolt and a tunnel trog to kill this, or some sort of inefficient play after this has been buffed. That can be the most ideal scenario, even if this dies. So I don't know. I'm kind of torn on this card. I'm not nearly as positive about it as a lot of the Hearthstone community at large is, who think it's just overpowered and super, super good. I don't think that's right at all. I think this is probably just an average 2-drop for Priest. Better than, of course, River Crocolisk, but sometimes it will just be a River Crocolisk. Other times it's going to give you some value. The problem, of course, is Priest doesn't really have a lot of great ways to damage this themselves to guarantee that the seal goes off. Of course, there's like Wild Pyromancer, but that becomes a pretty inefficient play rather quickly. So, I don't know. It's an average or slightly above average card, I think, that will definitely be played at first as people experiment with it. But I suspect that Priest as a deck likes to curve so late and be so control-oriented that this will rather quickly fall out of favor when people realize it just doesn't pay off enough and often dies for free. So I want to like this card, and I want Priest to run it, and I want it to be good, but I just don't think it's going to last as we experiment with this expansion and find a good Priest deck. So let's move on to a neutral minion this time. This is the Toxic Sewer Ooze. 3-mana minion, 4/3 in stats, so that's pretty good body. Of course, 3/4 is often more desirable because it survives more things. 3 health is rather easy to kill. It does have a battle cry, remove 1 durability from your opponent's weapon. So this falls somewhere in between an Acidic Swamp Ooze and Harrison Jones, right? Acidic Swamp Ooze is the very cheap, flexible tech card you add in to just punish your opponent's weapon plays. Harrison Jones is the much more expensive, value-oriented weapon clear. Not only does he destroy the weapon, but he also will draw you some cards for that weapon. And that is fundamentally, I think, the issue with this card, is that it's just somewhere in the middle. So it's not the hyper-cheap tech card of Acidic Swamp Ooze, nor is it the value-oriented tech card of Harrison Jones. It's somewhere in the middle and not really as good as either because it's slightly more expensive. So yeah, you get a better body than Acidic Swamp Ooze, but you don't totally destroy the weapon. It's only 1 durability, so it's not quite as an efficient or complete an answer to weapons as Acidic Swamp Ooze. So the stats really don't necessarily seem worth it to me, particularly at an increased cost, where often with tech cards you just want it to be as cheap as possible so that you can still play other stuff that fits your own deck synergies, isn't just about answering your opponents. And then, of course, in control style matchups, it's not nearly as good as Harrison Jones because, first off, the body is smaller, and you don't care about mana cost as much in control matchups, like you're willing to spend more mana, and Harrison Jones pays off way more dividends in a resource-oriented battle because he draws you cards. So I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with Toxic Sewer Ooze. It's, in fact, at its base, a pretty good card. It's got good stats. It's got a nice battle cry. There's nothing bad about this card. It's average to good. It's just awkward. It doesn't do what its cousins do better. So I don't really see any scenarios where you'd play this over either Acidic Swamp Ooze or Harrison. So a fine card, great in Arena probably. Not even really necessarily bad in Constructed. I think you'd just be well served to play a better alternative. So let's move on to another neutral minion, this time the Burgly Bully. I think this one is actually surprisingly pretty good neutral minion. There haven't been that many strong neutral minions yet in the Mean Streets of Gadgetzan set that we've seen, but I like Burgly Bully a lot. It's a 5-mana minion. It's got a 4/6 body, which really is not bad at all for 5 mana. That 6 health total is very strong because it survives through a lot of 5/5s that the game has. So, it doesn't trade super well necessarily, but it has a chance to stick around and actually eat more spells, which is what its effect is all about. Whenever your opponent casts a spell, add a coin to your hand. So, in many ways, this shuts out spell-oriented decks, maybe not as thoroughly as a card like Lotheb, but it at the very least discourages high-tempo spells from a deck like Tempo Mage, which wants to run a lot of really cheap spells to contest the board. If you play down a Burgly Bully, they either have to utilize some sort of resource like a fireball to kill it off quickly, or they have to go with their game plan and suddenly generate you 3 to 4 coins to efficiently deal with your board. And of course, that means that you're gaining tempo back because you can now accelerate your mana, play more stuff, and do more things. This will work particularly well in actually decks that like spells because, of course, the coins themselves are a spell. So Tempo Mages would love to run this minion as a mid-range minion, perhaps, just because if it does force your opponent to kill it with a spell, or at least discourage some spells, there's always that backup that you get those extra coins and are able to do fun stuff with Flame Wakers, etc. The real class that's going to love this minion, of course, is Rogue, particularly because a card like Tomb Pillager, which has been core to the success of Rogue. I mean, Tomb Pillager is a fantastic Rogue minion. It's actually going away relatively soon. It's only got probably 4 or 5 months left until the standard format rotation sometime early-ish next year. So it's going to need a replacement for Tomb Pillager, and Burgly Bully actually fits that really well. It's a little more expensive, of course, but it's still a mid-range minion, a mid-game minion. And I would argue the stats are even more favorable, and it has the likelihood to create more coins. Now, it's not guaranteed as much as Tomb Pillager, which 99% of the time resulted in a coin, because this is susceptible to minion trading, but Rogue doesn't really mind that necessarily. If they can play a high-value minion that forces your opponent to make bad trades, or sometimes even good trades, that allows you to clear their board, which is really one of the risks of Rogue, because often you don't want your opponent having a ton of stuff, and you want them to make bad trades because you're playing for some sort of in-game like Malygos, where you're going to kill them really quickly. So the longer the game stalls out and the less efficient they are with dealing face damage, the happier you are. So Burgly Bully serves as sort of a pseudo-taunt just because they're scared of the value that it can generate on your behalf. So they feel like they have to kill it either with a spell that generates you value or inefficiently sometimes with minions. So it serves a couple utilities in that way. It's a really interesting card that potentially pays off a lot of value, and it seems like spell-based decks are currently very, very popular, and I think will still be popular in Mean Streets of Gadgetzan. There are a couple new minion archetype decks with the Jade Golem stuff and the Grimy Goon stuff, but the Cabal in particular, of course, is really spell-oriented, so I think this card's going to be played. I think it's going to fit in a surprising number of decks, particularly Rogue, maybe Mage, maybe even like Druid, who knows. It's just good enough as far as stats are concerned that I think it's much better than the other Trogs, because coins can offer more passive value than just like attack buffs. So I'm all up on Burgly Bully. It's good stuff. Far above average card. In fact, good to great, I think. So let's move on to the next minion. It is the 4-mana Hosen Healer. It's a 2/6 and has a battlecry, restore a minion to full health. So this card's stats really aren't ideal. For 4 mana, you're hoping to pack a little more punch than just 2 attack. And 2 attack, 6 health is really good against more aggressive minions that are low cost, low health minions. So this would be great to trade into stuff like Zoo, for instance. But the problem here is that this battlecry, restore a minion to full health, is best when you already have a minion on the board that survive trades. And of course, when you're playing a deck like Zoo, you don't often keep minions on the board. They're very good at trading up and trading efficiently and keeping your side of the board clear. So I think the kinds of minions and the kinds of decks that this would be best against as a body, unfortunately, its battlecry doesn't reflect that. It doesn't synergize well. So you have to think about perhaps alternative uses for this card, serving it, instead of it being a body, it's more about serving this battle cry up in an effective way. And, there are a lot of big minions with, big taunts. For instance, Ancient of War, if it takes some damage, you could heal it up. But that's just a pretty inefficient play. And this minion, even though it could do that, how often does an Ancient of War get healed? How often is that relevant? How often do you want to hold a 4-drop until turn 8 to do that, right? Like, there's a lot of issues with that. One utility for this card, I think, is with Priest and Auchenai Soul Priest in particular. The way this effect would work, even with a full health minion, I believe, based on interactions that we've seen in the past with Ancestral Healing in Auchenai Soul Priest, that if you have a Soul Priest on the board and you play a Hosen Healer, this battle cry would instantly kill any minion. So it restores it to full health. So it casts, like, if you say it's an opponent's Ancient of War, it would restore it to fully 10 health. If you have Auchenai Soul Priest, that means it does 10 damage to the Ancient of War, instantly killing it. So that's an interesting little combo. That said, that's like an 8-mana combo, so I don't know that it's... How often are you going to have that Auchenai Soul Priest in hand, and the Hosen Healer in hand, and the big target to kill? Like, that could be pretty hard to pull off. That said, of course, Priest does benefit from minion heals in many other ways. So if there's any class that's going to make the Hosen Healer work, I think it could be Priest. I could even see a lot of implications of this card in wild format where things like Deathlord still run rampant, just because those are early game high health minions that often benefit from heals. So between Deathlord and the Velen Chosen's buff that you'd often see in wild format, Hosen Healer becomes much, much better because there's a high health early game target that's worth healing on curve. So you play the Deathlord on 3, your opponent trades a couple things in, you play the Hosen Healer on 4, and it's back to full health. So I think this card is average at best, probably below average even, but it may have some implications in Priest, and who knows what Priest needs to succeed. So it's going to be worth experimenting with at the very least, but I suspect it's really not all that good in the long run. And then finally, the final card in this particular review is the Fight Promoter, a new 6-mana neutral minion. It's a 4/4 in stats and has a battle cry. If you control a minion with 6 or more health, then you can draw 2 cards. So, that's a very, very powerful battle cry if it works. We've seen with cards before, like Ancient of Lore, pre-nerf, that was a 7-mana 5/5 that drew 2 cards, and that was incredibly powerful in Druid, and basically any class would have ran that card, I think, just because it was so good at playing a body and drawing resources. So, a 6-mana 4/4 does the same thing, feels right in line with that, and I think it would be played by a ton of classes if it always went off. But the problem here, of course, is that the condition on this battle cry, I think, is way too hard to achieve. How often are you going to have a 6 health minion just sitting on the board on curve on turn 6? Not very often. Most powerful stuff already has 5 health. Not everything has 6 health. So I don't think you're always going to have, or even often or ever going to have a 6 health minion just sitting around so that this is activated that easily playing it on curve. The other problem, of course, is that it's a 6-mana card itself. So even if you're like at full 10 mana, you can't play a 4-mana minion with 6 health. That's very, very, very incredibly rare. There is one right here, of course, right? But not that many good ones, or really any good ones. That would have to require you to build your deck in such a specific way to pull off this combo that I don't think it'd be worth it. You'd be compromising in too many spots. So, whether you're 10 mana, whether you're playing on curve, it seems incredibly unlikely that this card is actually going to successfully go off. I mean, maybe like 1 out of 10 times you see this card in your hand, it works. It's so rare. And, it's otherwise terrible because it's a 4/4 for 6 mana. So, I just can't imagine this ever works. I mean, maybe in Arena, it's halfway decent. Sometimes minions stick around in Arena, that Boulder Fist Ogre that your opponent ignores, for instance. So it's probably okay there. This card, if it works at all, maybe it could be in Grimy Goons decks, just because, you have minions that are going to be absorbing buffs and perhaps sticking around on the board a little more just because they're so meaty and so tough for your opponents to deal with. So, I could almost see this in a Grimy Goons deck. I think that's the only place it ever makes sense to me. Oops. Otherwise, I think it's unplayable. But we'll have to see how Grimy Goons works and if that makes any sense. Otherwise, Fight Promoter, sadly, probably won't ever see play. And that's going to wrap it up for my part 11 Mean Streets of Gadgetzan review. Just real quickly to review these, I think this is an excellent card. I think this is a above average card. I think this is an average card that won't ever be played. I think this is a great card. I think this is a weak card, and I think this is a very weak card. So, if you have any thoughts or comments of your own, I'd love to hear them. What's your take on these cards? What decks do you think they'll be in? Did I miss any cool synergies or fun stuff that these cards are going to open up as far as cool plays and neat stuff to see? Leave a comment below with all those thoughts and opinions. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.